The early November afternoon was blustery and cold, but Jill welcomed the feel of the brisk, invigorating air against her face. Ever since they'd seen Keith off at the dock yesterday, she'd been restless and jittery. The tremendous hope that had followed his kiss had quickly evaporated, leaving uncertainty, fear, and questions in its place. Sleep last night had been elusive, and the long, dark hours of wakeful pondering hadn't brought any resolution. What she needed was a long, secluded walk by the sea to sort things out. When she'd dropped Kyle off for his therapy session 20 minutes ago, she'd asked Marnie if she knew of such a private spot. The therapist had directed her to the perfect place, a deserted, wind-swept stretch of driftwood, strewn beach fronting an expanse of open sea. A sudden gust of wind whipped by, and Jill pulled up the collar of her jacket, tucking her hands into her pockets as she set off along the shore, determined to straighten out her tangled emotions. Except she wasn't sure where to begin. Until yesterday, she'd been able to convince herself that the look she'd seen in Keith's eyes on several occasions hadn't been attraction, but simple kindness. She could no longer delude herself with that notion. Though their conversation had been cut short at the ferry landing, and Keith hadn't had time to verbalize what was in his heart, she'd seen it in his eyes and felt it in his kiss. He was in love with her. That insight had been astonishing and exhilarating and exciting, not to mention scary. But there was something else that was even scarier. She was in love with him. Trying to pinpoint the exact instant when their relationship had made the leap from friendship to love was impossible. It had been a gradual thing, happening in almost imperceptible increments, until one day she'd realized that Keith had stolen her heart. But until yesterday, she hadn't been sure about his feelings. Now that she was, she knew that the solitary life she'd constructed with such care was on the verge of being reshaped. Assuming, of course, that he wanted to explore those feelings and follow a path that would deepen their relationship. But if he did, would she have the courage to upgrade her life, just as she'd upgraded her studio by adding a new structure that had changed her workspace, yet in the process made it bigger and brighter and even better? Did she have the courage to trust this man with her heart, to believe that his love would be true and constant, that he would always be able to look past her scars and see her inner beauty? Did she have the courage to let go of the past, to say goodbye? As she turned to the Lord in prayer, seeking answers, a gull swooped low in front of her, its raucous cry echoing above the breaking waves. And all at once she was transported back in time to a trip she and Sam and Emily had taken to the seashore the summer before the fire, while her husband and daughter had built a sand castle nearby. Jill had taken refuge from the sun under the small patch of shade afforded by the beach umbrella, enjoying their repartee and Emily's giggles as Sam teased her. After a while, a lone gull had circled above, raising its discordant voice and diverting Emily's attention. Jill could hear the conversation as if it were yesterday. "Listen, Daddy, the seagull is singing." Chuckling, Sam had reached over to tussle her hair. "Most people wouldn't call that singing, sweetie. Seagulls don't have a very pretty voice." Enthralled, Emily had shaded her eyes to follow the bird's graceful flight. "Well, it may not be pretty, but it made me notice him. And when I watch him up in the sky, I forget about his voice because he has such beautiful wings. He makes me want to fly, Daddy." "You can, sweetie. God gave you wings too." Sam had responded as he added a turnet to the castle. Puzzled, Emily had transferred her attention to her father. "Where are they?" "Right in there." Sam had given her chest a gentle tap. "By your heart. And God is always with you when you use them." Emily had puzzled over that for a few minutes, her face thoughtful as she shifted the sand through her fingers. "When you love somebody, is that kind of like flying?" she asked at last. "That's exactly right," Sam replied with a smile. "Love is the very best way to fly, in fact." He turned toward Jill then, and she could still recall the tender look in his eyes as his gaze met hers. "Your mommy has a very special gift for loving, the kind that makes you want to fly. I'm glad she shared it with us, aren't you?" The image of that warm summer day faded as another cold gust of wind whipped past, chilling the tears that were streaming down Jill's cheeks. Startled, she reached up with a shaky hand and brushed them away. It had been a long time since she'd taken any of her precious memories out of their sealed storage box deep in the recesses of her heart, and longer still since she'd cried over one of them. If Sam had been right, and Jill had a special gift for loving, it was a gift that had long gone unshared, locked away in a dusty box, just like her memories. But now a little boy who needed her love had entered her life, along with a man who wanted her love, and both had managed to find that dusty box in her heart and pry open a corner like a child in search of hidden Christmas presents. As she stared out at the sea, Jill's jumbled thoughts began to untangle. Like Emily's seagull, she was ready to spread her wings. Despite her fear, it was time to trust her heart, and to trust that the Lord would give her the courage she would surely need in the days and months and years ahead. Suddenly, with perfect clarity, she realized that she hadn't come here today to seek direction. She had come to say goodbye. Startled by that insight, Jill sank onto a large piece of driftwood and stared out at the undulating waves. Then, clenching her hands in her lap, she closed her eyes. Help me through this, Lord, she prayed in silence. Let my message find its way to the family I loved. When at last she began to speak, her choked, whispered words were caught and lifted by the wind. Sam, Emily, I came here today to tell you how much I love you, how much I'll always love you. Not one day has passed since you left me that I don't feel you close in my heart and wish we were together again, with thousands more memories to create and to share. But that wasn't God's plan for us. I take comfort in knowing that you're both in His care now, surrounded by His love for always. And I know someday we'll meet again. But in the meantime, I am still here, and there are two people who need my love. One is a very special little boy who has been hurt emotionally and physically. With each day that passes, I feel more certain that God brought him to me so that I could give him the kind of love he's never known, the kind of love that will help him heal and thrive and blossom. You would have liked him, Emily. He's curious and kind and loving, just like you were. I think you would have been great friends. The other person who needs my love has also been hurt. I didn't go looking for his love, Sam. It came to me in a way that I first attributed to chance, but now believe was something more. I think God led me to him, just as he did Kyle. Clasping her hands around her knees, Jill searched for just the right words. I never thought I'd love again after the wonderful life we shared, Sam. I never wanted to, but Keith is very special. I've known that almost from the first day we met, when he commented on my scars. In fact, they could be the reason he took a closer look at me, like the day Emily noticed the seagull because of his raucous cry, but then looked past it to see his beautiful wings and admire the way he could fly. Keith did that with me. He looked past my scars and saw beauty underneath, the kind of beauty that really matters, and the character and the spirit and heart. I want to help Keith and Kyle fly, Sam. You said that day on the beach that I have a special gift for loving. I hope you can understand why I want to share it with these two special people. Why, after all these years of mourning, of hiding in the shadows, I'm ready to step into the light again and make some new memories. But they won't diminish the love we shared. You and Emily will always have a special place in my heart, reserved only for you. that will never change. Drawing a shaky breath, Jill opened her eyes and looked up at the clear blue sky. I have to go now. That little boy I mentioned is waiting for me. But wherever I go, part of you will go with me. For always, I love you both so much. Tears once again blurred her vision, and as she groped for a tissue, a nearby piece of driftwood caught her eye, the size of an orange, its gnarled wood bleached white. It had been wrought over time by the ebb and flow of the sea into the shape of a heart. With trembling hands, Jill reached for it, stroking her fingers over the smooth wood as she followed the curving shape. How odd that among the thousands of pieces of driftwood on the beach, one bearing this shape would be lying at her feet. Her expression thoughtful, she tucked the symbol into her large tote bag. From this day forward, it would hold a place of honor in her home, reminding her always of the transforming power of love, of God's abiding presence when we spread our wings to soar, and of the simple truth that sometimes saying goodbye to the past is the only way to embrace the future. It's good to see you, son. Wrapped in a beer hug, Keith was too checked. Wrapped in a beer hug, Keith was too choked up to respond at once to his father's greeting. It had been almost a year since they had been together, but the link was as strong as ever, maybe stronger. After seeing firsthand in Kyle what could happen to a child who didn't have the benefit of a loving, supportive father, he gave thanks that he'd been blessed with this special man in his life. I'm glad to be back, Dad. His father released him at last, surveying him with a critical eye. Come in, come in. You look good. I feel good. Keith crossed the threshold and shrugged out of this coat. Better than I have in a long time. I have some homemade stew waiting, but from the look of you, I don't think you've missed too many meals lately. Are you saying I've gained weight? The older man's eyes twinkled as he took Keith's coat and slipped it on the hanger. Yep, another couple of pounds. You might be back to where you used to be. That landlady of yours must be a good cook. As his father turned to put the coat in the hall closet, Keith stuck his hands in his pockets. He hadn't planned to discuss the subject with his father so soon, but the older man had given him the perfect opening. To be honest, Dad, she's more than a landlady to me. Chuckling, his father turned back. Can't say I'm surprised. Startled, Keith stared at him. Why not? There was something in your voice when you talked about her on the phone. Bob Michaels shrugged. Intuition, I guess. I'm happy for you, Keith. A soft warmth flooded Keith's face. Yeah, me too. There's a lot I want to tell you about, and I want to hear all about it. We'll have a nice chat over dinner, but first, I had another call from Reverend Thomas. He wanted me to pass on a reminder that he'd like to talk with you before your visit. I figured I'd call him from there, if that's okay. I didn't want to have that conversation at a payphone or at Jill's. Sure. You want to do that first or after dinner? Do you mind if I do that first? I'd rather get that out of the way so we can concentrate on other subjects. Like that nice landlady of yours? Yeah. Keith's lips quirked up. With a wave, the older man directed him to the den. Help yourself. The stew will keep. As Keith settled into his father's worn leather desk chair and tapped the minister's number into the phone, he drew a long, slow breath. Things were finally falling into place. Just one more piece of old business to clear up, a record to set straight, and then he could move ahead with his life, make a fresh new start. His plans depended on Jill, of course, but he felt confident that she returned his feelings, even though they'd never given voice or expression to them until their parting at the ferry. Her eyes didn't lie, though. Yes, she was scared and uncertain, and apparently unconvinced that any man could find her attractive. But he was sure he could put those fears to rest when he returned, and that couldn't be soon enough for him. A man's greeting on the other end of the line snapped him back to the present, and he refocused his attention. Reverend Thomas? Keith Michaels here. Reverend Michaels! I'm glad you called. The long, unused title jolted Keith, as it had been when Gladys had hailed him with it. My father said you wanted to speak with me before Sunday. Is there a problem? No, no, not at all. I just wanted to pass on some information. I wasn't sure how much you knew about events that transpired here after you left. I don't know about anything that's happened since then, he replied, his voice flat. I wanted a clean break, Reverend. I had no interest in staying in touch with anyone. Call me Steve, please. And I understand your position, given the circumstances, but there are a few things you should be aware of that could affect your remarks. Keith doubted that. He knew exactly what he wanted to say when he addressed his former congregation. What he should have said in his own defense 2 years ago, when the scandal broke. He wanted the people he'd once shepherded to know the truth, which they hadn't heard from Susan Reynolds or through the rumor mill. His course of action was clear in his mind. He would lay the facts on the table, set the record straight, clear his name and move on. But this man, this stranger, had agreed to let Keith speak from the pulpit that was now his. He owed him the courtesy of a hearing at least. All right, Steve, I'm listening. I can sum it up pretty quickly for you. Since I didn't arrive until a few weeks after the controversy that led to your departure, I only had second-hand information and conjecture about what took place. That's all anyone had, including Ted Meckland, the so-called eyewitness. Keith couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice. They have more now. A year ago, Susan Reynolds accused the coach at the high school of the same thing when they were caught in a similar compromising situation. A shock wave rippled through Keith. Mike Schwartz? Yes. That's ridiculous. Keith knew that Mike and his wife had been having some marital problems 2 years ago. But he also knew the man had strong morals and would never break his marriage vows. Yes, it was. And he was determined to expose Susan. So he turned the tables on her. He confronted her in private, and they had a very interesting and revealing conversation, which Mike recorded. Plus, he'd brought along a witness who remained out of sight until the conversation was over. When Susan realized that her vindictive scheme had backfired, she left her husband and disappeared from town. No one's heard from her since. Needless to say, that escapade pretty much led any doubters in your case to conclude that you'd been a victim as well, with far more tragic consequences. In the silence that followed the man's revelation, Keith tried to process the unexpected turn of events. His status had changed from disgraced to vindicated, and it had changed a year ago, just about the time he started his travels, searching for answers and direction. Had he not cut all ties with the church, he might have discovered the truth sooner, saved himself a wasted year of anguish and wondering. Then again, if the truth had surfaced sooner, he would never have met Jill, or Kyle, or found the place he knew in his heart he was destined to call home. In the past 12 months, he'd learned to love again, and he'd found his way back to God. The year had hardly been wasted. In retrospect, it had been time well spent. Still, that left him with a dilemma about his address to the congregation. But that wasn't the minister's problem. He was just grateful that the man had tipped him off in advance. I wasn't aware of any of that, he told the pastor. And you're right. I'll need to rethink any remarks. Thank you for sharing the information. And thank you also for letting me borrow your pulpit for a few minutes on Sunday. It was your pulpit long before it was mine, and I'm happy to do any part to help make amends for the injustice you suffered. When Keith rang off and joined his father in the kitchen, the older man was setting the pot of stew in the center of the table. Just in time. Hope you're hungry. Uh-huh. Bob Michaels stuck a ladle in the pot and cast a shrewd look at his son. Bad news? No. But I'm going to have to rewrite my remarks for Sunday. Why is that? I'll tell you all about it while we eat. After a brief blessing, Keith relayed the conversation to his father. So I'm not sure what I'm going to say, he concluded. I'd planned to tell my side of the story, to do my best to set the record straight. But it seems that's already been done for me. I'm beginning to wonder if I should even go back. Interesting turn of events, I'll grant you that. His father helped himself to another serving of stew, his expression pensive. You're here, though, and scheduled to speak. Maybe the Lord wants you to share a different message. Twin furrows creased Keith's brow. Like what? Well, now, I'm not the preacher. That's your department, son. And I'm sure you'll figure it out. Why not pray about it? Ask the Lord for direction. If He has another message in mind for you to pass on, I expect He'll let you know. In the meantime, tell Him about that nice landlady of yours. The abrupt change in subject disconcerted Keith for a moment, but thoughts of Jill always managed to distract him, and it didn't take long for him to shelve his preaching problems for later resolution and switch gears. A smile curved his lips, and he rested his elbows on the table, his meal forgotten. She's very special. I kind of figured that. Tell me all about her. Keith was happy to comply, and when he finished, his father's smile mirrored his own. This sounds pretty serious. It is. And that brings me to a favor I'd like to ask. His father listened as Keith explained what he had in mind. Then he laid his worn hand on top of his son's, his eyes misty, his heart filled with gratitude for his unanswered prayers. Consider it done. Pretty remarkable, isn't it, when you lay them all out like this? Stunned, Jill stared at Kyle's drawing. They'd been done during therapy sessions over the past few weeks, and Marnie had lined them up in sequential order on the conference table in her office. The heavy, dark tones of the early pieces had lightened and brightened with each subsequent drawing. It's amazing, Jill replied. He's making good progress, and I credit most of that to you. Marnie began to gather up the drawings as she spoke. Isn't it incredible how even a little love can bring sunlight into a dark world? I got chocolate! Kyle burst into the room, his eyes glowing behind his horn-rimmed glasses. He'd held up a fistful of foil-wrapped kisses retrieved from the receptionist's treat drawer. That is something special. Jill dropped down to his level and smiled. You can eat those when we get on the ferry. But first, I promised Keith we'd pick up some pictures for him at the drugstore, and I have to stop at the market, so we need to hurry or we'll miss the boat. Standing, Jill turned back to Marnie. Thank you for sharing that. She inclined her head toward the stack of drawings. Considering your profession, I thought you'd find it very interesting and encouraging. Is there anything more I can do to help the process along? The woman smiled. As the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just keep on doing what you're doing. With an answering smile and a nod, Jill reached for Kyle's hand. Okay, sweetie, let's head out. After picking up Keith's prints and visiting the grocery store, they made it to the ferry just as the departure horn blew. Once aboard, Jill followed Kyle up the steep steps into the passenger lounge. She juggled the bag of film and her purse in one arm and hefted a large frozen turkey in the other. When she reached the top, she took a moment to catch her breath, keeping an eye on Kyle as he dashed toward the observation window to watch the departure. Then she headed toward one of the beaches, anxious to lighten her load. But as she leaned over to set the turkey on the seat, the 4 packs of photos slipped from the bag in her other arm, spewing images across the floor in a kaleidoscopic montage. Muttering under her breath, she bent to scoop them up, only to freeze, mesmerized by the pattern they revealed. It was almost a replay of what she'd been less than an hour earlier in Marnie's office, she realized. Like Kyle's drawing, Keith's photos showed a marked change over time. The first roll was easy to spot. It contained images that had been taken elsewhere before Keith arrived on the island, brooding and dark, many shot in low light or during stormy weather. They resonated with a sinister, threatening power, a power that could smother and crush and break. Those images frightened her, driving home how bleak Keith's outlook had been when he arrived on her doorstep. But subsequent photos showed a distinct change. Since she was keenly attuned to the foliage and colors of the island, the seasonal sequence was pretty easy to follow. As the summer had passed, the images changed. Dark gave way to light, dull gave way to bright, despair gave way to hope. The most recent points, including the one of Kyle cutting the ribbon on the studio, were filled with joy and warmth. Though Jill had observed Keith taking photos on several occasions, she'd never seen any of his work, and she was impressed by his talent. He had a great eye for composition, and many of his photos were evocative, resonating with imagery and meaning. But most of all, she was awed by what they revealed about the man. Something wonderful had happened to Keith during his stay at Rainbow's End. The proof of that was spread out before her. Jill wasn't a psychologist, but Marnie was, and her earlier words echoed in Jill's mind. Isn't it incredible how even a little love can bring sunlight into a dark world? Deep inside, Jill believed that. She'd seen it happen in her own life these past few months, and it seemed to have happened for Keith too. The transformation in both their lives was confirmation of the truth in those familiar words from Paul: love never fails. Overwhelmed with gratitude, she gathered up the images and tucked them back into their envelopes. And in the silence of her heart, she gave thanks. This morning, we have a guest speaker, a man most of you know. He asked for a few minutes of our time today, and I was happy to oblige. Reverend Michaels, the pulpit is yours. As Reverend Thomas finished his introductions, Keith entered the sanctuary. A murmur spread through the congregation like ripples from a pebble dropped into still water as he stepped up to the pulpit and surveyed those gathered before him, assessing their reaction. Some people stared, their eyes wide with shock and surprise. Some flushed in embarrassment and looked away, including Ted McLand, seated in his usual place front and center. Some fidgeted, their discomfort evident. Others smiled in welcome. Ever since he'd decided to speak to the flock he'd once shepherded, Keith had been determined not to let the congregation's response sway him from his message. He was no less resolute now. That message, however, had changed over the past couple of days, following his conversation with Steve Thomas. He looked toward the minister, who had taken a seat off to the side, and bolstered by his encouraging smile, Keith turned his attention back to the congregation. Most of the faces were familiar. Gladys and Frank were in their usual spot, just to the right of center, and Gladys smiled at him, then nudged Frank when Keith looked their way. The new members seemed confused by the undertone of tension in the church. "Good morning." A slight tremor ran through his voice, and he took a slow, steadying breath to dispel it. When he resumed speaking, his tone was composed and measured. "Most of you know me. For those of you who don't, my name is Keith Michaels. I was a pastor here for 12 years. 2 years ago, I left both this church and the ministry under difficult circumstances." The confusion on the unfamiliar faces in the congregation began to dissipate, confirming that they'd heard the stories about him. Over the past 2 years, as I tried to put my life back together and make some sense of what had happened, I realized that I had unfinished business here, and that I wouldn't be able to move on until I shared with you my side of the story and set the record straight. I didn't know if you would believe me, but I knew I had to try. Reverend Thomas was kind enough to grant my request for a few minutes at the pulpit. But in the past couple of days, I found out that a year ago, another incident occurred, similar to the one in which I was involved. Same perpetrator, different victim. Except this time the woman was exposed. I pray that all of you can now accept the truth of my innocence as well. When I learned this news, I almost canceled my visit today. It seemed my message had already been delivered in a far more convincing and conclusive way than mere words could ever convey. Then a very wise man suggested to me that perhaps the Lord wanted me to keep the state, but to share a different message. Gripping the sides of the pulpit, Keith took a deep breath. I puzzled over what that could be for a while. What else could the Lord want me to talk about? I began aimlessly paging through my Bible, looking for inspiration, and all at once the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians seemed to jump off the page at me. Be kind to one another and merciful, generously forgiving one another, as also God in Christ has generously forgiven you. The silence in the church was as still as a morning on Orcas Island. It was almost as if the members of the congregation had stopped breathing, so rapt was their attention. I knew then that this was the message the Lord intended me to deliver, and that it was meant as much, if not more, for me than for you. The fact is, many times in life bad things happen to us, unfair things, things that disrupt our world and reduce us to tears, to anger, to bitterness. No one is immune to those kinds of tribulations, including me. But anger and bitterness are destructive emotions. They isolate us from each other and from God. Where anger and bitterness have taken root, love cannot grow, nor can the seeds of forgiveness or hope or peace find fertile ground. I know this firsthand. For 2 years I asked God why He had taken from me so many of the things that mattered, that gave me life. Over and over I pleaded with Him for answers, and over, the only response was silence. In the end, I turned away from the Lord. Then I met someone who had also endured a great trauma, who had struggled with the same unanswered questions, but who had finally found peace. When I inquired how, the reply was simply, I stopped searching for answers. I stopped asking why. That's when I began to realize that often there is no answer, at least not one we can understand in our imperfect human state. I also realized something else. God doesn't call us to understand. Instead, He calls us to trust and to accept. And most of all, He calls us to forgive, to let the hate and anger and bitterness go, and to open our hearts so His life-breathing, giving love. My friends, that's not an easy thing to do. I still struggle with it every day myself. But it's the path He calls us to. And that's the message I want to leave with you today. A message of hope and of love. And a belief that both of these things can be ours if we learn to accept without understanding, to forgive and to put our trust in the Lord. Once more, Keith's gaze swept the room. When I left here, I felt I'd been wronged and betrayed, both by the people I had tried to help and by the God to whom I devoted my life. I was filled with bitterness and hate, and after a long struggle, I'm learning to let those destructive emotions go and to forgive as the Lord taught us. I ask that you pray for me as I continue that journey, just as I will continue to pray that all of us will take the Lord's message to heart so that we can live in the fullness of His grace every day of our lives. When Keith finished, there was silence, but as he turned away from the pulpit, the crowd rose as one, and applause rang through the small church. It followed him as he moved to the side and shook hands with Reverend Thomas, and it continued as the minister took his place behind the microphone. Only after a sustained ovation was the pastor able to resume the service. Later, when the final hymn had been sung, Keith joined the minister in front of the church to greet the worshippers. He was surrounded at once by members of the congregation who either wanted to ensure and assure him they'd always believed he was innocent. Gladys and Frank were in that group, or who wanted to apologize for doubting him. Many of the elders fell into that latter category, including Ted Mackland. However, he waited until most of the people had gone before he approached his former pastor. As the man drew close, Keith realized that he'd aged a great deal. He was more stooped than he'd been 2 years before, and his slow, uneven gait was steadied by a cane. His once ruddy complexion had faded to an unhealthy pallor, and deep creases crisscrossed his face. A significant weight loss had robbed him of the hardy, imposing presence that had once allowed him to dominate the board of elders. Bottom line, he looked like a spent, sick old man, someone more to be pitied than hated. You gave a good talk today, Reverend. Ted's stiff posture conveyed his discomfort with the situation, even as his slightly slurred, halting speech and the slack muscles on one side of his face explained his changed appearance. He'd had a stroke. Keith gazed at the man who'd confirmed the story of his indiscretion to the church elders, whose staunch refusal to believe his pastor's version of the events had swayed the board to withdraw its support and urge him to resign. From all appearances, he'd been through a tough time. Keith knew that if Jill was here, she'd find it in her heart to show compassion, just as she had for Kyle, grandfather, and the end, despite the man's faults. Sincerely, and surely he could do no less. Help me, Lord, to follow her example, he prayed. Thank you, Ted. I appreciate the kind words. The elder man gave a stilted nod and steadied himself, placing one hand atop the other on his cane. Or perhaps he was bracing himself, Keith speculated, as Ted stood a bit straighter and looked the man he'd accustomed and accused in the eye. I'm glad you came back, Reverend. When that woman left town last year, I wanted to try and contact you. Then I had this stroke. The apology in his eyes communicated his remorse even before he spoke the words. I wanted to say how sorry I was about all that happened. You and I, we didn't always see eye to eye. But you're a good man. Reverend, I made a terrible mistake, one I'll have to live with until the day I die. I've tried to make my peace with the Lord. I only hope that someday you can find that forgiveness you spoke about this morning. even though I surely don't deserve it. There was no question in Keith's mind that the man's contrition was deep and real. The price he'd paid in regret and sorrow was etched on his face. How could Keith add to the already heavy burden that weighed down his heart? All at once he felt the cold, bitter anger he'd harbored against the man for 2 long years begin to dissolve, melting like snow touched by the spring sun, leaving the ground ready for new life. If only those who deserved forgiveness received it, all of us would be lost. Keith responded in a gentle voice. It doesn't do any good to hold on to resentment or guilt. I'm learning to let mine go and move on with my life. It's time you did the same with my blessing. Keith extended his hand, and after a moment Ted reached for it. God be with you. Keith grasped the man's feeble hand in a firm grip. Thank you, Reverend. Ted's voice was a mere whisper, but his sincere gratitude warmed Keith's heart. As he limped away, Reverend Thomas joined Keith. Ted has suffered a lot this past year, not just physically, he murmured, watching the man depart. I could tell. I hope he finds some peace now. I have a feeling he will. And how about you, Keith? Did coming back here give you the closure you were seeking? His expression thoughtful, Keith turned back to the minister. There was a kindness in the man's eyes, and an understanding in their depths that touched his soul. Though the sprinkling of gray in the dark hair at Steve's temple suggested that he might be 10 or 12 years older than his guest, Keith sensed in him a kindred spirit, and knew that this was a man he could have called friend under different circumstances. To a large degree, yes, Keith responded, but I still have a little more work to do. Would you mind if I spend a few minutes in the chapel before I head back to Missouri? Not at all. I left it unlocked. Just pull the door shut behind you. I appreciate your support and hospitality today. Thank you. He extended his hand. I was happy to help. Steve returned the handshake. Have a safe trip back. Left alone at last in front of the church he'd once thought of as his own, Keith slowly made his way back inside, choosing a pew about halfway back. He sat on the polished wood and lifted his gaze to the simple cross that hung against that wall, facing the congregation. Finding his way home had been a long, arduous journey, fraught with loneliness and despair, but good had come out of it, too. His faith was deeper now. He had a richer, fuller understanding of the darkness that could plague even a believer's soul, that, in turn, had enhanced his compassion and empathy. He'd found the peace of mind that comes only from true communion with the Lord, from surrender to his will. God's love once again flowed through him, filling his life with light and hope. And along the way, he'd also found human love from a special woman and an endearing little boy who even now awaited his return. And he was anxious too, to leave the past behind and focus on the future. But first, he needed to say thank you. He needed to take one final step on his journey toward forgiveness, and he needed to say goodbye.